Okay. Hi again, everyone. Last time we discussed different ways of conceiving of the causes of death with a particular emphasis on health behaviors and on smoking, alcohol, and gun deaths especially. We continue to look at various public health interventions that could be used to address causes of death seen that way, for example, taxes and laws and counter-marketing interventions. And today we're going to be talking about income inequality. Now, income inequality is an intrinsically collective socioeconomic status measure or property. And it can be contrasted with the strictly individual measures that we've so far been considering, such as education, income, or race. In other words, I can speak of your wealth, and I can speak of the average wealth of all of you, but inequality in wealth is not something that each of you have. Inequality of wealth is a collective property of a group. So we're going to begin to mark a transition now as we think about public health to begin to look now at these types of more collective measures. And I want to provide a sort of pivot for the conversation we're going to be having soon about the importance of social support, social networks, and social capital to individual health. And I want to examine how yet another social structural feature can influence the health of individuals. So now this is a pretty standard way to chart variation in wealth around the world. So this shows a per capita GDP in 2011. And you just color the countries according to which country has the greatest average wealth per person. And you can easily see the rich and the poor countries, and they're mostly the ones you would expect. There's nothing shocking or too surprising about this kind of graph. This is a very standard approach to understanding variation in wealth by country around the world. And also not surprisingly, the wealthier the country is, the healthier it is. Here on this graph on the x-axis, we plot the GDP per person, making a correction for something known as purchasing power parity, expressed in US dollars. And on the y-axis, we show the average life expectancy in years. And every one of these dots is a country. And you can see that the richer the country is, the longer the people in that country live. It's not a linear relationship. There are declining marginal returns, but still increasing to per capita income. In other words, here at the lower part of the curve, each improvement in income or average wealth leads to a dramatic rise in health, in longevity. And here it gets flatter and flatter. So every extra dollar here doesn't do as much for the average life expectancy in the country as every extra dollar here does, but it's still increasing, right? In general, the curve is, rising across time, even though there's declining marginal return with time. But there's another way to look at wealth, one that privileges not how wealthy each country is per capita, but rather how that wealth is distributed within each country. This slide shows the income inequality around the world, quantified by something I'll elaborate on in just a moment, known as the Gini coefficient, which measures how unequal is the wealth or how equal is it. The green countries, the wealth is more similarly distributed. So for example, the Scandinavian countries were rich, just like, for example, the United States and Australia were, but here, Scandinavian countries have less income inequality. The wealth is more equally distributed. And the redder and redder countries, the wealth is more unequally distributed. For example, in many African countries or in South American countries. And it turns out that both the absolute level of wealth and the distribution of that wealth might be relevant to health outcomes at various levels of geography, as we're going to see. Well, how might one measure the inequality in the distribution of wealth? What would be a completely unequal distribution? Who would like to suggest a totally unequal distribution of wealth? Anyone? Yes. Someone popped up in my screen. I can't see the name, Maggie.
So if like one person had all the wealth and everyone else had no wealth?
Yes, that would be really unequal. Now, there's a little wrinkle in that conceptually that always gets me annoyed, which is that apart from the richest person, everyone else is equally poor in that example. But yes, technically that's the most unequal distribution. And what would be a completely equal distribution? Kenneth.
Yeah, if all wealth was divided perfectly equally.
Yeah, if everyone had the same amount of wealth. Now notice right now we're just talking about outcome. We're not talking about opportunity or deservedness. That is, we're just making a numerical description. We are not making a moral assessment, okay? We're just sort of describing how is the wealth potentially distributed. And in fact, here is one way that this inequality can be quantified. This is known as the Gini coefficient. In this is a number that goes from 0 to 1, and 0 corresponds with perfect equality, where everyone has the same income or wealth, and 1 corresponds with perfect inequality, where one person has all the income or wealth, and everyone else has 0 income. Now, algebraically, it's half the arithmetic average of the sum of the absolute differences between all pairs of incomes in a population normalized to the mean income. What the hell does that mean? Okay, it's actually quite simple. What I do is I say, I look at my income, and then I look at Severin's income, and I subtract those two, and I get an absolute difference between me and Severin. Then I look at me and Kenneth, and I compare my income to Kenneth, and I subtract the difference between me and Kenneth's income, and I take the absolute value of that difference. And then I do, who's else on the screen here? I can't see her name. Well, anyway, there are people here whose names I can't see for whatever reason. Anyway, there's another person on the screen, and then I do her, and I subtract the difference between my income and her income, and I take the absolute difference, and I keep doing that for all the pairs of comparisons between me and every member of this class, and then I average that. That's the average difference between me and all of your incomes. And then I move to the next person. I move to Severin. And Severin, then we do the same calculation, Severin minus Maggie, and Severin minus Kenneth, and Severin minus everyone else. And we compute the absolute value for each difference and average across that. And that's the average income between Severin and everyone else. So for each person, we have the average difference between that person and everyone else. And then we take the average of those averages. That's the Gini coefficient. So you index between the first individual J, from J equals 1 to N, and then you subtract from individual I, for each individual from I equals 1 to N, you take the difference between that individual's wealth or income and every other individual's wealth or income, scrolling J between 1 and N, and then you divide that, you compute the mean, which is divided by N, and you do that twice, that's why it's N squared, and you divide it by the average income to normalize it. So that's the Gini coefficient, okay? It's the average of the average differences between all pairs of people in a population. And that's the formula for the Gini coefficient. And typically this can be used to measure income inequality, but it can be used to measure distribution on any axis, such as inequality in education or height or age or anything else that you might want. And another way to describe income distribution is to use something known as a Lorenz curve. So a Lorenz curve takes on the x-axis the decile of households. So this is the first 10%, the poorest 10% of households, the next poorest 10% of households, the next poorest. Now we've got 30% of the households, 40%, all the way till we get 100% of households. And then we look at the proportion of total income, the 10%, the bottom 10% of the income, then the next percent, and so on. And what this slide says is that 20% of the lowest 20% of the households have 5% of the income. And the lowest 50% of the households have 20% of the income. And of course, when you get to 100%, it has to be anchored. So by the time you get to 100% of the households, you've got 100% of the income. So 0% of the households must be 0, that point is anchored. And 100% must be 100%, that point is anchored. And in between, you can have any of these curves you want. This is called the Lorenz curve. If this line of equality is if all the income were equally distributed. The bottom 10% had 10% of the income. The bottom 20% had 20%. The bottom 60% had 60%, and so on. That would be the line of equality. And this is the Lorenz curve. And it turns out that the ratio of the area between the line of perfect equality and the Lorenz curve, this A, and the area underneath the Lorenz curve, B, the Gini index is A over A plus B. All right? So this quantity here, A, is actually the Gini index of this population. It's the area between the diagonal and the Lorenz curve. It's actually the fraction of that area compared to all of the area below the line of equality. Now, every point on the Lorenz curve, therefore, represents a statement that the bottom 20%, a statement like the bottom 20% of all households have 10% of the total income. Now, there could be other measures of inequality as well. For example, the Robin Hood index approximates the share of the total income that has to be transferred from households above the mean to those below the mean to achieve equality in the distribution of incomes. How much do we have to take from the rich to the poor and transfer to the poor to get equality of incomes? It is equivalent to the maximum vertical distance between the Lorenz curve and the line of equal incomes. So you start here, you say, is this how much from here to here? Is that how much money we have to take? Or is it this or this? And you get to this point and it's the biggest drop, this vertical line here. If we take that much money from the rich and transfer it to the poor, then we would equalize incomes. Or you could compute other measures like the proportion of total income earned by the bottom 50% or 60% or whatever number you pick. You could say, what fraction of the income is earned by the bottom 50% in this country or in the world or whatever. Or you could just look at the statistic that the 2,153 billionaires in the world, the 2,000 billionaires in the world, have more wealth than 4.6 billion people who make up 60% of the planet's population. So the top 2,000 people have more wealth as a group than the bottom 4.6 billion people on the planet. And income inequality in the United States, as measured by the Gini, has varied across time. So if you hear on the x-axis is time from 1910 to 2000, and you know the Gini is varying. Here is the roaring 20s, right, where we get this enormous increase, the time of the robber barons, when our Gini coefficient was above 50, which is really high, or 0.5 rather. And we are approaching, nowadays, we're approaching this moment. The nadir in inequality was around 1970, and it's been rising since then. And we're approaching this moment. In 2008, the Gini was 0.49 in our country, okay? Rising still. We're almost to where we were 100 years ago in terms of the magnitude of economic inequality in our society. In fact, even among wealthy countries, there's variation in how wealth is distributed. The wealthy are not the same everywhere. These are some findings of a survey of population's ideal ratio between CEO and unskilled worker pay, and also their estimation of the reality in each country. Estimated pay is always higher than ideal pay, but the gap between the two varies, and perceptions about ideal pay vary. So for example, here's the United States. These represent the ratio. These are bands that represent the ratio of CEO pay to worker pay. So for example, in the United States, people think the ideal ratio of CEO pay to worker pay is that little circle right there, which is about 6 times. People think that the ideal CEO, people think ideally that a CEO should make 6 times the worker pay. And then we ask them, well, what's your estimate of what that number really is? And people estimate right here that it's about 31 times. People think the ideal ratio of CEO pay to worker pay is about 6, and they estimate that in our country it's about 30. That's the United States. And then you can keep going around other countries, and you can see that each country varies. For example, here is Taiwan. The Taiwanese think that the ideal ratio of CEO pay to worker pay is about 20, And they estimate that the actual ratio is about whatever that is, 32 or something like that. Does everyone understand this graph? And of course, the peak red line varies, and the ratio between the red and the blue varies. So estimated pay is always higher than ideal pay, but the gap between the two varies, and the perceptions about ideal pay also vary. So this is the estimation, and this is the reality. This shows the actual ratio of CO to worker pay, how that falls across a range of countries. And the formerly blue and red clusters that were on the previous graph are now these minuscule little amounts here. So here's the United States. We used to have in the United States, here we thought that the ideal pay was 6 and the estimated pay was 30, but actually the actual ratio of pay is 351. That the actual CEO earns 350 times what the typical unskilled worker makes in our country. Far out of keeping with the typical American sense of what's ideal and the typical American sense of what's actually happening. The reality is not in keeping with either of those situations. And of course, the United States is an outlier in this regard within other rich countries. For example, Denmark, unsurprisingly, although there's a gap, it's a lower gap. The average Danish CEO makes 50 times what the average unskilled worker makes, compared to 350 for the United States. Where's Japan? And here's Japan. It's about the same. The Japanese tend to be more egalitarian in their compensation. So actual pay exceeds not just ideal pay, but even estimated pay, and in some cases by a huge margin. And here's a closer look at the ratio of CEO pay to average wages. The United States has a ratio of about 500 to 1. That was in 2007 and 2011. So the average CEO makes about 500 times what the average worker makes, far exceeding what's seen in all other countries, rich democracies that are shown here. So the point is, it's a lot of inequality. And in the last few decades, most real income growth has gone to the wealthiest people. In other words, it's true that our society has gotten richer, and that's good. That's a very good thing. But where is that wealth going to? This is the 50th percentile from 1967 to 2013. In 2013 dollars, the median worker has gotten richer. Their real, in 2013 dollars, they've gone from $43,000 to $51,000, but it's not a lot richer. And the poor person has also gotten richer at the 10th percentile, but not by much. But the 95th percentile has almost doubled their wealth from 115,000 to 196,000. So you see, the rich have been getting richer and richer over the last 50 years or so. And this is one of the things I think that, and many people think, is contributing to a lot of political and social turmoil in our society. So we all have a better standard of living now than we did in the past, in countless ways. It's clearly better to be born now than it was to be born 50 years ago in terms of our material comforts. But the gains have not gone equally or even remotely equally across the income spectrum. And this is causing some issues, as we'll see. And indeed, inequality varies not just across time in the United States, but also across space. This graph shows the relationship between Gini and mortality adjusted for age in each state in 1990. And the circles have diameter proportional to the population. So this shows the Gini of income per adult. Just shows the income inequality, just as the Gini. So by state, so some states have much more equal income distribution, some much more unequal distribution. And then this shows the log odds of mortality, so higher rates of death and lower rates of death. And you can just plot all the states, and you can see that there's some kind of relationship between higher levels of inequality and higher likelihood of dying. So here is Mississippi and Louisiana, and here is Utah and New Hampshire on the bottom part of the distribution, and every state sort of in between. There seems, in other words, to be some relationship between the inequality and the longevity or the measure of health. But one question that arises is the following. Well, first of all, there's one question that arises is maybe there's something else that's different about those states. For example, maybe these are the poorer states. You know, Mississippi and Louisiana are poorer, let's say, than New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine and Wisconsin. So we're going to have to take that into account, and we will in just a moment. Or maybe other things are going on that's different between those two states. And furthermore, another question we have to ask is the following. Is everyone in unequal areas being harmed? Or maybe just those people at the bottom? And the answer is actually that unequal income and hierarchy may not be bad just for those at the bottom. This is actually a very contested hypothesis, and it appears to be extremely sensitive to the level of geography that we are speaking about. In other words, whether inequality is bad for those at the bottom may depend on whether we're talking about cities, counties, states, or countries. The level of geographic aggregation may be important in assessing whether inequality has a relationship with health outcomes, however measured, here being measured by mortality risk. Because as I said, Louisiana and Mississippi are poorer than Utah and New Hampshire, not just more unequal. And so we want to account for that as well. And there's a similar relationship between income inequality and mortality across U.S. Metropolitan service areas, MSAs, and that is, which is a smaller level of geography. So if you do the exact same calculation, but you do it for cities instead of states, once again, you get this kind of line where the more unequal cities in general have a higher risk of mortality. Now, what do we mean? And we'll return to this in a few lectures when we talk about neighborhood effects, but what do we mean by the possible effect of an area in which a person resides? This sets forth the key intellectual distinction that I want you to understand about this, which is the difference between compositional and contextual effects of some local area. Either the area context could matter, and that's the difference that places make to people, or the area composition could matter, and that's the difference that people make to places. For example, suppose that neighborhood A or city A has twice the mortality rate of neighborhood B or city B. Well, what if everyone in neighborhood A was just an old person? You know, neighborhood A just had all these nursing homes. There'd be nothing surprising about the fact that they had higher mortality. That would be a compositional effect. That would be these people are older, and so therefore that's the difference that people make to places. That's why this area seems to have worse mortality. Or maybe, in fact, area A is much worse. For example, maybe there's a toxic waste dump in area A, and people there are more likely to die. That's a contextual effect, and that's the difference that places make to people, okay? The toxin is killing you here, and here it's the people themselves that make that area seem worse. And income inequality is an intrinsically contextual effect. In other words, it can't be a compositional effect. Inequality is something about the area. It's like air pollution. It characterizes the place. The inequality is a characteristic of place. But maybe people who live in more unequal areas are different. Maybe people who live in more unequal areas are on average poorer or older or have something else about them that's different. So we have to take that into account if we're going to try to make a claim that something about living in an unequal area makes your health worse. So is that clear to everyone so far? Any questions? I can't see you guys, so you have to help me. If you have questions, you need to raise your hands or speak up or ping Maggie and say you have a question or something, because I have no way of seeing. I only see 4 of you, only 3 of you, only 2 of you whom are named. I don't know why. Kenneth and Severin's names are on my screen, but there are also 2 other people who I don't know who you are. Anyway, you seem to be interested, so that makes me happy. One woman has a green, has a ceiling shade and a green wall in her background. And one man seems to be in some kind of nice living room with white curtains behind him. Those are the other two people I'm seeing. Okay. So does living in a more unequal circumstance actually affect the health of individuals? Now, initial work in this area, in this field, was purely ecological. In other words, they just said, here are 1,000 areas, or here are 50 states. Do people who live in more unequal states, do states that have higher inequality, are they also states with worse mortality, like the graph I showed you? But it turns out that that is susceptible to an annoying statistical problem called the ecological fallacy, which I don't have time to go into. But that was how the early research was done. But since then, we've had better approaches because recent studies have had superior designs that take into account individual attributes in addition to contextual attributes. And here's some results from a particularly well-conducted study from your reading, assessing how state-level inequality, net of individual income and other factors, can harm people. And this is a study that looked at people residing in the continental United States. There were over 500,000 individuals aged 18 to 74 between 1987 and 1994. And they were followed up for an average of 5 years, and there were about 20,000 deaths that occurred among those people over the 5 years of follow-up. They had individual level family income binned in 27 categories, which they adjusted in other ways, for inflation and family size. That's fine. And state level Gini characterized in 5 levels. And they also knew the age, race, sex, marital status, state level poverty, median income in the state. So they knew a lot about the individuals and also about the states, how rich or poor were the states. And this is what they found. So first of all, they found that this shows the income inequality and individual mortality risk. First, let's look at the family income. And if you were in the high income group, we say your relative risk of death is 1. You're the benchmark against which we're going to judge you. And if you're in the middle income group, you've got a 50% higher odds of dying. And if you're near poor, you've got 2.14, almost twice the risk of death as the rich. And if you're poor, 2.69, 2.7, almost 3 times the risk of death of the rich. So this is totally to be expected. Poor people are more likely to die. That's the SES effect on health that we discussed a few lectures ago. But now, after controlling for your age, sex, wealth of the individuals, how rich the states were, and a whole bunch of other stuff, another part of the regression equation estimated what was the relationship between how unequally the wealth was distributed in your state and your risk of dying. And it found, and there were 5 levels of inequality. This is the 20% of the most equally distributed states, and the 20% of states that had the most unequal income. And the most equal states, they set the relative risk was 1. So individuals living in the most equal states had the lowest risk. And then as inequality rises in the states, you get this gradient of rising mortality risk, such that people in the most unequal states, the 20% most unequal states, had 12% higher odds of dying compared to people in the most equal states, after taking into account the age and income of the individuals. And just to be clear, this level of inequality is like Scandinavia or Japan. And this level of inequality, this Gini, is like Morocco or Australia or the United States, okay? So this is a high level of inequality. And this takes the same results, but now plots them. This is taken from your reading. It's a very fundamental and important graph. It shows income inequality and individual mortality, broken into the 4 income categories: the poor, the near poor, the middle income, and the high income. And then within each category, according to the state income inequality categories. Are you low on inequality, more inequality, or the highest inequality? And it shows the death rate per 100,000 person years. So for example, in the near poor, so first of all, the wealthier you get, these curves go down. So the likelihood of death is lower for the high income people than the poor people. But within each individual level income category, for instance, among the near poor, the more unequal is the income in your state, the more likely you are to die. There's this upward slope within the near poor category and this upward slope between the middle income category. But for the poor, it's sort of flat. And for the high income people, it's sort of flat. Why? Does anyone want to speculate why state level income inequality seems to be associated with mortality risk in the near poor and the middle income, but state level income inequality is not associated with mortality risk in the rich or the very rich or the very poor? Any ideas? Maggie, can you call on people? Maggie, can you call on people?
Yeah, I thought I called on Severin. Maybe you didn't hear me.
Oh, sorry. I'm not especially sure about the middle portions, but I think for high income, it's probably that if you have access to money, you have access to the best healthcare regardless. I mean, I guess if your state doesn't have a great medical care, if anything, you can go to a different state. So maybe that's one way to explain why there's no difference.
And do you think healthcare actually is what makes a difference in people's longevity?
I guess that is fair.
At this point in the course, I would certainly hope I had persuaded you to be at least a little skeptical. But yes, your point, you're letting you off the hook for the allusion to the access to healthcare. The fact is that, yes, maybe the rich can insulate themselves from whatever is the potential adverse consequence of inequality. We'll get to some of those explanations shortly. Yes, Matt. I can see Matt's name now all of a sudden. I don't know why everyone's names just popped up.
So this is speculative, but it's possible that looking at the poor group, the reason it's universally high is just because basic material needs are not met. So if you don't have that, you're not gonna like be healthy and continue to live as long. For the middle two groups, it may be they have their basic material needs mostly met or met, but perhaps like feelings of inadequacy exacerbate stress and other factors that could negatively influence outcomes. And for high income groups, obviously you have all the material needs are met and they're at the top of the social food chain, which has other consequences.
That's an excellent explanation, quite likely true. Lots of research has been done in this area. Thank you. And in addition, a related idea is that maybe the very poor, it doesn't really matter, right? I mean, if you're suffering at the bottom, whether there's income inequality or not above you is the least of your, concerns, the least factor that say that's right. Although these are simplifications, and we'll come to some ways in which, for example, in very unequal areas, the rich may not care as much about the poor. So there may be lower, more regressive taxation or other kinds of things that really crush the poor. All right, we'll return to some of these ideas, but you can see that it's complicated, right? It's a complicated topic. The main determinant, the big variation is, of course, your individual level income, right? Like these people have like 1,000 deaths per 100,000 person years. These people have 300. But, there's some variation by state level as well, which is not as pronounced, but is still present. Here's some results from another investigation. And these show that within every level of individual income, including among the richest, unlike the previous slide I just showed you, living in a United States state with more inequality is associated with worse health, here measured as maternal depression. So this shows the percent of women who've given birth that have depressive symptoms according to the income of the woman, and also within each category according to the Gini coefficient. Identical kind of mapping and framing as the previous slide, different data, different outcome, but the story, the kind of analysis is the same. You have, of course, richer people, as you move from left to right, risk of maternal depression goes down, but within each category, you have an upward sloping in all the categories now, including the poorest and the richest. So this upward sloping is important. But as I noted earlier, the results about the effects of income inequality are mixed. These are data from still another investigation, here of 10,000 people nested within 60 metropolitan areas of the United States. And the investigators obtained various self-reports about chronic medical conditions and examined how local income inequality at the level of cities, net of individual income and other traits, was associated with these health conditions. And they found little evidence for any effect. They're sort of flat sloping. Now, this is not the same as a previous graph. So here, these are conditions, pain, is the prevalence of pain vary according to the fifths of income inequality? Not much. Depressive symptoms, not much. Arthritis, not much. They're mostly kind of flat. There's not an obvious pattern. Now, the Subramanian and Kawachi review, which is in your reading, suggests that this is still an open question. But there are nevertheless some interesting generalizations that are possible from the work that's been done so far. First of all, weirdly, if you look at the literature on this topic of inequality in health, there tend to be many more findings of an effect in the United States than in other countries. We can speculate as to why. Other countries may provide a different kind of social safety net, for example. And second, within our country, there are more findings of a relationship between income inequality and health at the state level compared to other levels, which is a hint about possible mechanism maybe having to do with state level political policies. In other words, if we're more likely to find an effect at the state level than at the city level, and we're more likely to find a level at the state level than at the country level, maybe there's something about states and the way they vary in their policies that may affect the relationship between income inequality and health. And this is one of the best studies done to date, and I don't remember if I signed it in the readings. Maggie, did I sign this in the readings? The Chetty piece?
I don't think so.
Okay, so this is one of the best studies to date. This is income data for the United States population were obtained from 1.4 billion tax records. So they had 1.4 billion tax records that they could get inequality from. They could get income from between 1999 and 2014. And they had complete mortality follow-up, like perfect follow-up, because it was linked to Social Security records for individuals between 40 and 76 years old. And this figure shows population-weighted univariate correlations between local area characteristics and race and ethnicity adjusted expected age at death for 40-year-olds in the bottom and top income quartile. So it shows a correlation between life expectancy at age 40 in the United States and the correlation between that life expectancy given certain local area characteristics. And we're going to look at the richest people and the poorest people. So for example, if you look at the fraction of people who are current smokers, a high fraction of current smokers is associated with higher risk of death, both amongst the poor. So this shows Pearson correlation coefficient. This is 0, means no relationship. Negative means there's a negative relationship. Positive means there's a positive relationship. It shows there's a negative correlation between the fraction of smokers in an area and the likelihood of dying, or the longevity, for the poorest people, and it's negative. So more smokers means more risk of death in the poor, and more smokers means more risk of death in the rich, although maybe less so. This is closer to this line than this is to this line. What about inequality? This slide shows that amongst the poorest 25% of the people, the Gini index is not associated. The dot is here, but the confidence interval includes 0, which means basically there's no relationship between Gini and the poorest, but it is with the richest, okay? That just like smoking, high inequality harms the richest 10%, richest quartile of the distribution. And finally, we can look at local government expenditures. The more the government spends on people, that's positively correlated with longevity in the poor. In other words, spending money, government spending, reduces the risk of death among the poor and doesn't have much of an effect among the rich, as you would expect. So there's a lot more going on in this slide, but it gives you a hint of how you can begin to look at different factors at the state level and how they operate at different points in the distribution to get an insight into what might be causing the association between inequality and outcome. So inequality was more negatively correlated with life expectancy for individuals in the highest income quartile, contrary to the idea that inequality has the most adverse effects on the health of low-income individuals. So these data suggest that actually the rich can be harmed by inequality. And conversely, government expenditures help the poor more than the rich. And finally, the estimated health burden of inequality in the United States is actually quite high. And the Kondo et al. Reading provides a meta-analysis of the effects of local inequality, documenting the likely impact. This slide shows the relative risks for subsequent mortality for 30 rich countries, in particular, the estimated number of deaths that would have been avoided if we could have brought inequality below 0.3. So in the United States, the actual Gini is 0.35. If we could bring it down to Canadian level of inequality, we would the fraction of estimated 1.5 million, we would reduce excess deaths by 800,000 or something like that. Is that right? A fraction of estimated 1.5 million averted deaths, 57% of the 1.5 million averted deaths would be due to the decline. So the point is, people can estimate by how much, like if we were able to bring American inequality down to Canadian levels of inequality, like how many lives would we save or how many years of life would we gain? All right. Well, how? Yes, Eamon, you disappeared.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you barely. You're faint, but I hear you.
All right. I was wondering why in countries like Portugal, where it's about the same as the U.S., the amount of excess deaths that could be avoided is like really low. It's right above the U.S.
It's not that much different here, but I don't know why this fraction is so much lower than this fraction. So I don't know the answer to that. But you can look at the article and get back to me. How about that? I'll throw it back. I'll throw it back in. And you classic professor trick. When I was an attending physician in the hospital, when I used to train young doctors, they were very smart doctors. I was an attending at Harvard, and so they were bright young students. And sometimes they would know more than I did. And a classic trick, if you're an attending, is the student says, "Well, professor, what should we do to care for this patient?" You're like, "What would you do?" You ask them. So I don't know, Eamon. I don't know why that the details of this chart are not part of what I remember.
I'll take a look at it. Thank you.
So how might social inequality affect individuals? So this shows three classes, and this is important. Three classes of explanations linking income inequality to individual health. The first class of explanation are the so-called neo-material environment explanation. And they're neo-material in that they reflect the modern environment that we humans have and construct. So for example, things to do with differential social spending. I mentioned that already. The neglect of the environment. Maybe in unequal societies, people are less sensitive to climate change or less worried about pollution, and therefore we create more problems. Or there could be an underinvestment in human capital. Maybe in more unequal areas, we are less concerned with public education. Or there could be something known as lower social capital, an idea I'll come back to in a few lectures. Maybe more unequal areas, there's something that is in the area that affects people adversely. For example, egalitarian societies may make more investments in the common good. There might be more investments in infrastructure used in common and shared by all, like trauma centers or techniques for reducing pollution. Maybe in more equal societies, people say, any one of us could actually need a trauma surgeon and a trauma center. Let's spend money on trauma centers, which we never know who's going to get injured in an accident and is available to everyone. Or we all should care about air pollution. So maybe more equal societies are more likely to invest in techniques for reducing pollution. Or there might be greater investments in so-called public goods, such as food safety, or public education, or library books, or even maternal health, things that benefit everyone, rich and poor alike. We all benefit from more public education. The poor because they get a free education, the rich because they have better workers, more educated workers. So a more egalitarian society might also have less crime, and fewer rich people might be shot. And there could be a development of what is called social capital, which I'll come back to. Or, as Lynch and all argue in your readings, income inequality might be associated with educational and medical expenditures per capita, or investments in vaccination, for example. Maybe more egalitarian societies are more likely to do things like vaccinate their public, which benefits everyone. A rich person benefits if the poor are vaccinated. And these types of things might in turn have cumulative effects that affect people over their lifespan and spillover effects as well. So this may be a bit confusing, but I'll nail it in a moment. I'll give you a kind of simpler way of understanding what I'm talking about. These are the neo-material environment explanations. Things around us, spending and vaccination and clean air and trauma centers that explain why inequality might affect health. But the second set of explanations are the psychosocial environment explanations. And these include things like the direct physiological effects like stress, or direct psychological effects like relative deprivation. And we're going to consider those next time. But the idea here is that inequality can work by psychosocial means. In other words, psychosocial processes might damage our health. So if you're in a more unequal environment, you might say, this sucks. Most of the people are above me. There's a lot of inequality, and I'm stressed by that. And that might be the mechanism by which inequality harms me. Or inequality might erode social bonds, or contribute to latent social conflict, or hostility, or resentment that harms everyone. The rich might be angry at the poor might be angry at the rich. When you have more inequality, you might have more anger in the society, okay? These are psychosocial mechanisms. In other words, income inequality might produce adverse effects inside people's bodies or outside people's bodies. Income inequality might affect your health badly by what it does inside your body, or income inequality might affect your health badly by what it does outside your body. The material environment explanation and the psychosocial environment explanation. And these mechanisms may reinforce each other and actually may operate at different levels of geographic aggregation, larger and smaller. For example, the neo-material effects may be at large areas and the psychosocial effects at small areas, for example. In other words, when you compare yourself to others, you might just look around your little town or your little classroom. So these relative deprivation or the stress of being around richer people might matter if you see them, if you live right next to the rich people. But if they're 100 miles away on the other part of the state, it doesn't matter that there's some rich person there. But the neo-material explanations, like government spending, for example, might affect you no matter where you are in relation to other people. And of course, these mechanisms may reinforce each other, as I said. Moreover, income inequality over smaller areas might have either more or less of an effect than inequality over a larger area. And it might be less since investments occur at the state level, or more since we assess ourselves over a smaller range, as I just said. And finally, there's this third explanation, the so-called individual income explanation, which is a technical explanation for the relationship between inequality and health that I'll come back to in just a moment. We'll consider the first one in a moment, the neo-material environment explanation, but let's start with the psychosocial environment explanations. Do you know that feeling you get when you walk past first class to your economy seat when we used to travel? Do you guys remember that feeling? Raise your hands if you've had that feeling of walking through, this part of the airplane to get to this part of the airplane. Yes, right? We all know that feeling. It sucks, right? I mean, it's really irritating and humiliating to walk through this luxury and then you get to your, cattle car. And it makes everyone feel envious, but it passes. Eventually you get to the back and you sit there and, your flight goes. You maybe stop thinking about the people in first class, or your flight ends after 4 hours or 6 hours and you arrive. And once you're where you are, you're really not thinking anymore about that experience of when you boarded the plane. And the question is this psychosocial feature the feature that harms you during your flight? Is that why you feel less rested and more stressed when you arrive than the more fortunate first-class travelers? Is it the psychosocial, the fact that you compared yourself to these people, the richer people in first class, is that what makes you feel worse off? Or is it the material conditions? Do the people in first class have more room, or get more sleep, or have less noise, or fresher air? It turns out they have fresher air because the air is piped into the plane from the front and flows to the back, okay? Or better food. These are the neo-material explanation for the effect of inequality in seat assignment on how you feel on your health, okay? Is it psychosocial or material? And this distinction is important because it has relevance for policy. Under the psychosocial interpretation, these health inequalities would be reduced by abolishing first class, right? If the psychosocial explanation is the explanation, and we want to reduce the inequality, if we want to reduce the adverse health impact of inequality, we'd have to abolish first class. Or maybe we offer therapy to everyone that's not in first class to make them feel better, right? Say, okay, here's a coupon for a therapist. You're walking past first class, you get to the economy class, and we'll have someone talk to you about how you feel, and that'll reduce the impact, okay? Those would be psychosocial interventions. But from a neo-material viewpoint, what we would need to do is upgrade the conditions in economy class. Now, of course, both sorts of effects could obtain, but they might have different magnitudes. And you can actually use the Gini measures to quantify inequality in seat space. Remember, I said that you can use it not just to quantify income or height, but other things like seat space, and plot how it's changed across time. So you can look at planes, this is inequality in the skies and how inequality has changed across time. So for example, in old planes, 7% of the passengers right here in first class used about 25% of the passenger space, and the 51 people in economy, the 51 people in economy plus used about 30%, and then the sardines here used another 157 people. They used 45%. I'm sorry. So I'm sorry, I was speaking about this one. So this is from an old plane. 75% used 15% of the room, and the other 93% used 85% of the cabin space. And this plane had a Gini of 0.08, very equal. Remember, for reference, the United States Gini is 0.48. But things have become much more unequal. So this is another plane in the intervening period, which had, what are the numbers here? 12% used first class, 25% of the space went to the economy plus, 50 and the sardines, 157 people were in 45% of the space. That's a Gini of 0.16. And on transatlantic flights, it's even worse. Your Gini is 0.25. So here are the people in first class. They get, I don't know, there's some small number of people and they have like almost half the plane. And then you get these sort of in-between people and they have, I don't know, a third of the plane. And then you've got like half the people that have less than a third of the plane. And this, incidentally, gives you a nice way to appreciate how unequal our society has become. It is more unequal even than the allocation of space on planes, all right? It's even worse than this. We have a Gini of 0.48. But of course, this is complex because the people up front paid more money for different space and amenities. And actually, economy class may be great compared to, taking the bus or walking, right? So your alternative to get to California is either to ride here or to walk. This is a terrific deal, right? You sit here for 8 hours or 6 hours, you fly across the country for $400, that's extraordinary compared to the alternative. So it's complicated. Still, the modern airplane reflects a social microcosm of a class-based society, making inequality salient to passengers through both the physical design of the plane, the presence of first class, and more subtly, the boarding procedures. In other words, whether economy passengers must pass through the first class cabin, as I mentioned before. In other words, one thing you could do is board the economy passengers from the rear of the plane, so they don't even see first class. That would be, quite a nice psychosocial intervention to reduce resentment. One study hypothesized that both types of inequality on airplanes, the physical inequality, the presence of first class, and the situational inequality, the boarding location, could trigger antisocial behavior like air rage incidents. And this study examined the rate of air rage, quantified as the number of incidents per 1,000 flights. And the results in the slide show that the chances of an onboard economy class incident are 3.84 times higher when a first class cabin is present than when it is absent. So this shows the dependent variable. This is the dependent variable. This is an economy class incident, all flights, and an economy class incident when there is a first class present. And this shows the predictor variables. So for example, if the flight is delayed, you have more likely to have an air rage incident. The coefficient is above 1 in the regression model. That's not surprising. But if the first class is present, you compared to first class not present, you have 3.84 times more likelihood of getting an air rage incident, just from the fact that you maybe had first class or not. And then they looked at if you boarded from the front or not, and you're 2.17 times more likely to have an air rage incident if you board people from the front and they see the first class before they get to the back of the plane. So inequality can be bad for your mental health. Now, lest you think that abolishing first class is a crazy idea, take a look at this event from a few years ago. This article is an article that's, about lunch ladies slammed for food that is too good. And this was in Sweden. A talented head cook at a school in central Sweden has been told to stop baking fresh bread and to cut back on her wide-ranging veggie buffets because it was unfair that students at other schools didn't have access to the unusually tasty offerings. Annika Eriksson, a lunch lady at school in Falun, was told that her cooking is just too good. Pupils at the school have become accustomed to feasting on newly baked bread and an assortment of 15 vegetables at lunchtime, but now the good times are over. The municipality has ordered Eriksson to bring it down a notch since other schools do not receive the same caliber of food, and that is unfair. From now on, the school's smorgasbords, from now on, the school's vegetable buffet will be halved in size, and Eriksson's handmade loaves will be replaced with store-bought bread. Her traditional Easter and Christmas smorgasbords may also be under threat. Parents and pupils alike find the municipality's order, but parents and pupils alike find the municipality's orders distasteful. Fourth graders at the school have even launched a petition in protest against the decision to put a lid on Eriksson's passion for cooking. What do you guys think about this? Is this a good idea? Should we stop Annika Eriksson from being such a good cook at her school in the name of equality? Yes or no? I want to see your faces for this, so I'm going to stop sharing slides. Who thinks this is a good idea? We should stop Eriksson from doing this. Okay, raise your hands if you think we should not stop Eriksson from doing this. We should let her do it. Okay, some of you are not raising your hands to either, and I want you to take a stand. I want you to take a stand. So we should allow this inequality. Thank you. You can take your hands down. We should not level the playing field. We should not abolish first class because of the bad effect of inequality. This class has just decided in this application. All right. Any case, your sensibility was, of course, was captured by the Swedish government, and they, because of the parents and the children, they said, no, we are not going to stop Ms. Eriksson from baking bread and providing more vegetables to the students. And the decision was reversed. But lest we laugh at the Swedes, sometimes we attempt crudely similar things in the United States. Consider the allocation of slots in competitive schools in New York City. This story reads the following: to make elite schools fair, city will punish poor Asians. Here's the reading of the story. In 2004, seven-year-old Ting Shi arrived in New York from China, speaking almost no English. For 2 years, he shared a bedroom in a Chinatown apartment with his grandparents, a cook and a factory worker, and a young cousin, while his parents put in 12-hour days at a small laundromat they had purchased on the Upper East Side. Ting mastered English and eventually set his sights on getting into Stuyvesant High School, the crown jewel of New York City's 8 specialized high schools. When he was in 6th grade, he took the subway downtown from his parents' small apartment to the bustling high school to pick up prep books for its 8th grade entrance exam. When he was in 6th grade, he did this. He prepared for the test for the next 2 years, working through the prep books and taking classes at one of the city's free tutoring programs. His acceptance into Stuyvesant prompted a day of celebration at the laundromat, an immigrant family's dream beginning to come true. Ting, now a 17-year-old senior starting at NYU this fall, says of his parents, who never went to college, they came here for the next generation. New York's storied specialized high schools have, for more than 70 years, admitted students based upon a competitive examination of math, verbal, and logical reasoning skills. But now, troubled by declining Black and Hispanic enrollment at the schools, opponents of the exam have resurfaced. For example, Mayor Bill de Blasio has argued that relying solely on the tests creates a rich get richer dynamic that benefits the wealthy who can afford expensive test preparation. But as Ting's story illustrates, it may not be affluent whites, but rather the city's burgeoning population of Asian American immigrants, a group that remains disproportionately poor and working class, whose children have aced the exam in overwhelming numbers. And ironically, more holistic and subjective admissions criteria would be much more likely to benefit children of the city's professional elite than African American and Latino applicants, while penalizing lower middle class Asian American kids like Ting. Okay, what do you think about this one compared to the lunch lady? Who thinks we should abolish the testing because it's just not fair that Ting is getting into this school? Who thinks we should not abolish the testing and we should continue to have competitive examinations? Come on, you have to take a vote, damn it. You Yale students, for the love of God. There is subtlety here. I know it's more complicated than that, but what's your initial take? You're struggling, right? It's not so easy as the lunch lady, isn't that right? You see, it's not easy, damn it. These are complicated topics, okay? But there's an isomorphism to the lunch lady. When we see inequality, what do we do? Do we try to like lop off the top and prevent that from happening? Like abolish first class, abolish Stuyvesant, get rid of Anna Eriksson's nice, foods? Or do we try to do something different? It's not easy. Personally, I think the examinations should stay competitive for Stuyvesant, but I acknowledge that, it's complicated. All right, let's go back to sharing slides. If I were in a classroom right now and I had you in front of me, I wouldn't let you off so easily. So you should count this as a benefit of the of the pandemic that I can only see 25 of you and I can't have you argue because it's not easy and it's educational to argue about this topic, okay? You could take both positions completely legitimately in this situation. And by the way, in the Erickson situation as well. And if you're inconsistent in the two, you better have a damn good reason. If you said, no, let Erickson cook the fancy meals, but you said, no, abolish the test, you have to be able to explain why. Otherwise, you're not being logical, you're not being fair, you're just, making decisions capriciously driven by some other agenda, which isn't the right way to make public policy in my view. Okay, let's go back to where we were. All right. So now let's turn to consider the so-called individual level explanation. How much time do I have? I've got 14 minutes. Good. So let's consider the individual level explanation, the individual income explanation for the relationship of local inequality to individual health, which was the third item on the list that I mentioned. If you had to draw a relationship between SES and health, you could imagine a few steps or a few shapes for that relationship. Here we're going to have on the let me get my little pointer out again. So here on the x-axis, we have your socioeconomic status, let's say your income, poor and rich, and here we have health. And one possibility is that it's a step function. You're in crappy health until you get to this level of income, and then bang, it steps up, and then that's the same health for the rest, a step function. And that's plausible. I think one of you earlier mentioned it. Maybe once you can afford the basic necessities, food and shelter, maybe your health doesn't suffer any longer. And you have everyone above that has the same level of health. That's one possibility. Or it could be a linear relationship. The more money you have, the better your health is. So every extra dollar from here to here gets you an increment of health. And that's the same as an extra dollar from there to there gets you the same improvement of health. A linear slope. That's possible. Or at the individual level, similar to what I showed you at the beginning of this lecture at the country level, it could be curvilinear, right? It could be concave down with decreasing marginal return to socioeconomic status, but still monotonically increasing. That means it increases across the whole range. So as you get richer, you always get healthier, but less and less as you get richer and richer, okay? So there's a lot of improvement here, and here the slope becomes more gradual. This is also possible. Now, a very fundamental reason, this is important and nice actually, that the health of a population depends not only on the average income of the population, but also on the inequality in income within the population is as follows. And the intuition is straightforward. Each additional dollar of income at the individual level raises individual health by ever smaller amounts. So this is the curvilinear shape, which is actually the real shape, that is actually the curve. And it says that if you go up by X dollars here, you get only this improvement, the alpha improvement, this tiny improvement in health. Whereas you go up by the same amount here, by X dollars here, you get this beta improvement. And what it says is that if we redistribute income, if we take $100 away from this guy and make him this much poorer, his health will suffer by this small amount. But if we then give that $100 to this poor guy and raise him by this amount, his health will improve by some larger amount beta. So redistributing income and lowering inequality improves health. The average wealth in the population does not change. If you take $100 away from me and give it to one of you, the total wealth in the population is the same. The total sample size, the total population size is the same. So the average income is the same. The average income doesn't change when you take money and give it from one person to another person. But the average health does change, because if you take $100 away from me, my health only suffers this tiny amount. But if I give the $100 to a homeless person, their health goes up by a bigger amount. So reducing inequality by transferring money around, while it doesn't change the average wealth, does change the average health. But only if the curve has this shape. If the curve was linear, then taking X dollars away from me would reduce my health by alpha, and giving it to a homeless person would increase their health by beta. And so the average health and the average wealth would stay the same. So if in fact, as known to God, the relationship between wealth and health is curvilinear, as it is, then that is intrinsically why inequality might be associated with poor health. Because the marginal return to extra dollars at the top is lower than the marginal return at extra dollars at the bottom. So the curvilinear relationship between income and health itself can contribute to the relationship of inequality to health to some small extent. That is, if all that matters to health at the individual level is absolute income, and if the health-income relationship is nonlinear, average health in the society will improve as the average income increases, and average health will also improve as inequality of income decreases. A community with more equal income will tend to have better average health than a community with more inequality for the same total income. And this is called the absolute income hypothesis for explaining the inequality health relationship. And it is a mechanism having to do with individual level health and wealth. The way it works is at the individual level. Now, just to be clear, this is not just static. A dynamic change might have a different result, as a rich person might change his or her behavior if you took $100 for him or her. It's another whole topic, but this is the gist. Now, methodologists have tried to take this into account because there's no doubt that the concavity of the SES health relationship explains at least part of the population level association between inequality and health. That is, this individual level relationship could explain part of the societal level relationship. The association between income inequality and mortality, but the association between income inequality and mortality, nevertheless, however, goes beyond what can be explained as a statistical artifact of this individual level relationship. This graph shows the results from an analysis based on 1990 data for the 50 US states. Two separate sets of 50 points are co-plotted. Each point in these scatter plots represents one of the 50 states, with the area of each circle proportional to the state's population. The black line shows the downward sloping relationship between inequality and health outcomes that would arise solely as a result of the concavity. And the blue line shows the actually observed relationship in the same data. In other words, if we made up data with its 50 states of the size that they had and took into account their inequality and their mortality, we would see a slight downward sloping. There would be some artifact, because of the concavity and the relationship, we would see at the individual level, at the collective level, we would see a subtle, slight relationship between higher inequality and higher mortality. But in fact, the real data is much steeper. It cannot be explained by this third factor, this artifact, although the artifact is very important. So in fact, something else is going on here. Some of the psychosocial effects and some of the neo-material effects, which we'll come back to next time, talking about more of them. Any questions before I let you go? Yes, Ayman. No question. Anyone else? Are you learning? Good. Okay. See you on Thursday.